On the 6th of September, 2022, Ukraine launched a massive counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. As a result of this rapid operation, the armed forces of Ukraine liberated nearly 12,000 square kilometers of territory previously occupied by the Russian army. Simultaneously, Ukrainian troops restored control over part of the Kherson region. Although intense fighting had been ongoing in this direction since the start of the war, the Russian grouping, unable to withstand the pressure and the threat of encirclement, abandoned the city of Kherson in November 2022, retreating across the Dnipro River almost without a fight. The outcome of these two operations was the withdrawal of Russian troops from more than 18,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian land. As trophies, the armed forces of Ukraine captured a significant amount of abandoned equipment and ammunition. However, after November 2022, Ukraine has not demonstrated operational successes of a similar scale. If we discount the local raid into the Kursk region in 2024, the Ukrainian army has practically ceased to conduct large-scale offensive actions. The figures illustrate the dynamics. Having initially occupied more than 99,000 square kilometers, Russia then lost 18,000. But over the past 2.5 years, it has regained control over more than 91,000 square kilometers. If the current trend continues, by 2026, the occupied area could return to the initial indicators. So what happened to the Ukrainian army? Since the beginning of the full-scale war, it has received intelligence from NATO countries, modern weaponry, and has been scaling up its own production, particularly of drones. Despite the resilience of its defense, its offensive potential appears to be exhausted. Attempts at breakthroughs are local and tactical in nature. Let's examine the reasons for this fundamental change. The year of hopes and illusions. Are human resources inexhaustible? This was the illusion, according to former Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Viktor Muzhenko, in an interview with Texty.org. UA, that many Ukrainian commanders shared at the beginning of the war. According to his assessment, in the first months, there was a prevailing confidence in Kyiv and the General Staff that mobilization was unnecessary, that there were enough volunteers, and any losses would be compensated for by new patriots. Operations were planned based on this myth, without considering demographic limitations, mass emigration, and the number of individuals unfit for service. Muzhenko pays special attention to the Kharkiv counteroffensive in the autumn of 2022, Ukraine's main tactical success. Despite the liberation of territories, the operation had serious consequences. High casualties and the lack of an operational pause for regrouping severely weakened many units of the armed forces of Ukraine. The advance halted at the line of the Chorny-Zherebets River, and the strategic objectives reaching Svatov and Kreminna were not achieved. The withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson during the same period boosted morale, smoothing over the high cost of the Kharkiv operation in the public perception. The culmination of 2022 was the Battle of Bakhmut. To hold it, Ukraine was forced to commit a total of about 25 brigades, suffering extremely serious losses. On the 21st of September, 2022, the day Russia announced partial mobilization, the conflict definitively entered the phase of a war of attrition, in which it continues to this day. The price of superiority. At the time of the invasion, the total strength of the Russian armed forces was about 1 million people. However, only approximately 190 to 200,000 could be allocated for the war with Ukraine. Ukraine's forces were estimated at 210,000. Thus, the attacking side was initially inferior in numbers to the defending side. Russia's manpower deficit was so significant that it could not even seize the undefended city of Sumy, located just an hour's drive from the border. Taking into account the forces of the Donbass, People's Republics, the total size of the Russian grouping by the summer of 2022 reached approximately 350,000 people. At the same time, according to a public statement by President Volodymyr Zelensky in August 2022, about 1 million people were under arms in Ukraine. A unique, nearly threefold numerical superiority in manpower was created, supported by real-time NATO intelligence. Maintaining the initiative on any section of the front seemed a matter of technique. However, it was precisely this tactic of continuous offensive that became a fatal mistake. Until 2024, the Ukrainian command often did not consider it necessary to thoroughly plan operations, relying on the inexhaustibility of human resources. Reality turned out to be different. After Russia announced mobilization, created a system of financial incentives, and, crucially, after Ukraine's enormous losses in the offensives of 2022 to 2023, the reserve of trained volunteers was exhausted. At the same time, The ratio of barrel artillery throughout the war remained in Russia's favor at a level of 10 to 12 Russian guns against 1 Ukrainian gun, which predetermined the high losses of the attacking side. The result was a crisis of mobilization resources. Since December 2023, a harsh, forceful mobilization began in Ukraine. Mobilization crisis. December 2023 marked the beginning of a wave of forced mobilization in Ukraine. Widespread cases of detentions by employees of TCCs, territorial recruitment centers, including outright kidnappings of people from the streets, caused an explosion of public outrage. Despite protests from lawyers, deputies, and human rights activists, the practice continued, gradually becoming a new norm. By January 2025, open societal resistance began to grow. Anger, long accumulated in social networks and kitchen conversations, turned into direct action. Cases became more frequent where residents forcibly took back detained individuals, and in western regions and rural areas, spontaneous protests involving the seizure of military enlistment offices occurred. Women organized impromptu checkpoints, hindering the work of mobilization teams. Paradoxically, despite the harsh methods, official mobilization indicators remain low. The armed forces of Ukraine barely managed to conscript about 30,000 people per month. At the same time, according to data from ex-MP and drone company commander Ihor Lutsenko, approximately 20,000 servicemen monthly leave their units without authorization, AWOL. In October 2025, a record was set. At least 21,602 people left the service. The total number of deserters has exceeded 500,000. Despair has reached such a degree that potential conscripts resort to extreme measures, including self-harm, to avoid being sent to the front. Corruption scandals around TCCs, where employees were arrested for bribery and released on bail, only intensified public cynicism and aversion to the state. Social crisis. An illustrative example demonstrates the depth of the social crisis. In a video interview, a former Armed Forces of Ukraine serviceman, forcibly mobilized and having lost both feet at the front, states that the state limited itself to awarding him a medal, providing neither full rehabilitation nor stable financial assistance. There are tens of thousands of similar cases. Neglect of veterans and the absence of social guarantees undermine the last remnants of trust and citizens' willingness to defend the state. This is reflected even in recruitment for the most technological and safe branches of the military. For instance, when 15,000 vacancies were opened in the Unmanned Systems Forces operators, IT specialists, cooks, the actual influx was minuscule. In the first 25 days, 10,000 applications were received, but about two-thirds came from active servicemen wishing to transfer from other units. Only about 35% less than 3,500 were civilians, and only 1,828 candidates reached the interview stage. Society is demoralized. People do not want to fight not only in the infantry but also to serve in rear technical units. The main contingent of the modern armed forces of Ukraine consists of mercenaries and forcibly mobilized individuals, often lacking proper training or motivation. Conclusion. The last conditionally successful month for the armed forces of Ukraine was September 2023, when they managed to recapture 54 square kilometers of territory from the enemy. Since then, for 27 consecutive months, Ukraine has only been losing territory. If at the end of 2023 losses were measured in tens of square kilometers per month, now the count is in hundreds. Ukrainian society is tired of the war. Kyiv no longer has either numerical superiority or overwhelming advantage in artillery and UAVs. Strategic initiative has been completely lost. Society is responding to forceful mobilization with growing resistance. The objective reality is that since 2023, Ukraine has strategically lost the war of attrition. It has exhausted its mobilization resource, and its army is largely held together by forcibly conscripted individuals. To stabilize the front, at least a prolonged operational pause is urgently needed. The later Ukraine enters negotiations, the worse its final positions will be. The only way to save statehood is the immediate search for a diplomatic way out of the conflict, based on a harsh assessment of the real balance of forces. Continuing the war leads only to the further degradation of the country, its economy, and its human capital.